They used to laugh behind my back. At family dinners, at baby showers, even at holidays. I could feel their eyes on me. Their whispers stung more than any diagnosis. Poor Emily. Still nothing? Or worse, maybe some women just weren't meant to be mothers. The worst part? It wasn't just strangers. It was my husband's family, my in-laws, even my own sister Claire, the one I trusted with everything, once joked that maybe I was just too cold for a child to want me. I smiled through it all. But inside, I was drowning. Years of IVF, sleepless nights, prayers that went unanswered. And then he left me. David, my husband, gave up on us. Right when we were approved for adoption. I found out days later he was seeing Claire. Yes, my sister. The betrayal burned more than the infertility ever did. So I disappeared. I moved out of state. I changed jobs. Everyone thought I broke down, but I was building something. 2 years passed, quietly. Until last week, when I walked into that charity gala in Manhattan, wearing the red dress they said I'd never dare to wear again. And by my side, a little boy, my son, my beautiful, brilliant, adopted son, Liam. Their faces turned pale. Claire spilled her drink. David looked like he'd seen a ghost. I didn't have to say a word. I just smiled. The same smile they once called empty, because I had what they thought I never would, peace. And I didn't need their approval, their pity, or their presence. I just needed me, whole, finally. So yes, they said I'd never be a mother, but now they can't even look me in the eye. Have you ever been underestimated and came back stronger? Tell me in the comments. And don't forget to share this with someone who needs to hear it. Back then, my life looked picture perfect from the outside. I was married to a man everyone adored. David was charming, confident, and successful. A financial advisor with a polished smile and an even more polished reputation. We had a cozy apartment in the Upper West Side with big windows that let in soft golden light every morning. We had routines: Tuesday takeout, Friday wine nights, lazy Sundays walking through Central Park. People envied us. We were the couple you see in magazines, smiling, holding hands, posting brunch photos with filtered sunshine and hashtags like grateful and dar use against the world. But I've learned that perfection is often the prettiest lie. It started with hope. Pure, blinding hope. David and I had been trying for a baby for over a year. At first, it felt like an adventure. Timing cycles, making jokes about practice, buying tiny socks we didn't need yet, just because they were cute. I remember the first time I was late. I ran to the bathroom with shaking hands, took the test, and waited on the edge of the tub. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. Then, a single line, negative. David hugged me, said, "It'll happen when it's meant to." I wanted to believe him, but month after month, the tests stayed negative. And slowly, something changed. I changed. I became obsessed with timing. I stopped drinking coffee. I read every fertility blog, joined forums, tried herbal teas, acupuncture. I went to the doctor alone for tests, blood work, ultrasounds. Words like ovarian reserve and hormonal imbalance became part of my daily vocabulary. David stayed supportive in the beginning, at least on the surface. He came to the first 2 appointments. He held my hand when I cried. But after that, he started to pull away. He'd forget important dates, like when I had to start my injections. He began coming home later, always with a reason. Late client meetings, drinks with coworkers, gym sessions that stretched for hours. And then there were the comments from his family. "Still no bun in the oven? You know, Emily, some women just aren't cut out for it. Don't take too long. We want to meet the little walkers soon." They said it with laughter, like it was harmless. But every word felt like a blade, and David never defended me, not once. At Thanksgiving, his sister announced her second pregnancy right at the dinner table. The room erupted in cheers, and all I could do was smile and dig my nails into my thigh under the table. No one noticed. No one ever did. Except Claire, my sister. She was there that day. She gave me a look, one I couldn't quite read. Pity, maybe? Or guilt. She leaned in later and whispered, "You're so strong, Em. I don't know how you do it." I thanked her. I needed someone on my side. I believed she was. I was wrong. At the time, I still thought the problem was me, my body, my age, my stress. I blamed myself for David's distance, for the way he started sleeping facing the other side of the bed, for how he flinched whenever I mentioned adoption. I remember one night, after my second failed IVF round, I sat at the kitchen table with my head in my hands, silently sobbing. David walked in, looked at me, then just grabbed a beer and walked out again. Not a word. That's when the shift happened. Not in him, in me. I stopped talking, stopped sharing, stopped hoping out loud. But I still believed, foolishly, that we were in this together, that this was just a rough patch, that things would get better once the baby came. We even started the adoption process, finally. After our third failed IVF, I said I couldn't do it anymore. David agreed too easily, said, "Let's just move on." I should have seen that as a sign, but I took it as progress. We got accepted into an agency and began the waiting process. I even started decorating again, soft colors, a mobile with little clouds, a rocking chair by the window. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of joy again, but all along, something dark was already blooming behind my back, and the ones who should have lifted me up were already tearing me down. They say a woman's intuition is a sixth sense. I used to think that was just something people said to comfort themselves when things didn't add up, but now I know it's real, and when it whispers, you better listen. At first it was subtle, a glance that lingered too long, a pause between words, a moment that felt off. David had become a stranger in his own home. He'd stopped calling me babe months ago, replaced it with neutral tones like M or just a hollow hey. He wasn't cruel, he was cold. And cold is harder to fight, because you can't argue with distance. You can only feel it. One night, I walked into the bedroom to find him quickly locking his phone and turning it face down on the nightstand. "Everything okay?" I asked, casually. "Yeah, work stuff," he said, without looking at me. Work. It was always work. But I knew his job. I worked in the same industry. There's no such thing as a client call at midnight or emergency meetings on Sunday. And yet, he kept using those excuses, over and over again, as if I'd stopped noticing if he said them enough. The more I pulled back emotionally to protect myself, the more secrets seemed to spill through the cracks. One morning, I noticed his cologne smelled different. Not bad, just different. Sharper. Something I didn't recognize. When I asked, he shrugged it off, said he'd tried a sample from work. But David hated change. He'd worn the same scent since college. Then, there were the conversations that stopped mid-sentence when I entered a room, the awkward silences when his phone would buzz and he'd glance at it with panic before sliding it into his pocket. I told myself I was being paranoid, that my hormones, my stress, were making me see shadows. But it wasn't shadows. It was the beginning of truth. One Saturday, I caught a moment between him and Claire at a family barbecue. It was so fast, so subtle. If I hadn't been watching, I would have missed it. He handed her a drink, and their fingers touched for a second too long. Her eyes darted to mine. Then she smiled. Too wide. Too fake. My stomach dropped. Claire had always been close to David. She was the fun, flirty, slightly rebellious younger sister. Everyone loved her. And she had a way of getting attention, especially male attention. But I had never, ever thought she'd look at my husband that way. Still, I said nothing. I wasn't ready to believe it. Not yet. I needed proof, and deep down, I think I already knew it was coming. That week, I started noticing patterns. David would come home and immediately jump in the shower. His shirt sometimes smelled like floral perfume. Once, I found a stray blonde hair on the passenger seat of his car. Not my color, not my length, not mine. When I confronted him about it, he laughed. Actually laughed. "Are you serious, Em? You're accusing me of cheating because of a hair? You need to relax." Relax. That word infuriated me. It's the word people use to silence women when they're too close to the truth. But I stayed calm. I smiled. I apologized. And that was the moment I stopped giving him the benefit of the doubt. That night, after he fell asleep, I opened his laptop. He'd always kept it password protected, but this time, for some reason, maybe arrogance, maybe comfort, he hadn't logged out. And there it was. His email. his messages, his photo backups. A single folder labeled Work Travel. I clicked it. Inside were dozens of photos, not of hotel rooms or spreadsheets, but of her, Claire, my sister. There they were, at a wine bar in Soho, in a hotel pool, smiling, toasting, wrapped in towels. I couldn't breathe. My ears rang. My fingers went numb. The betrayal was so deep, so complete, it didn't feel real. I stared at the screen, willing it to change, willing it to be someone else, anyone else. But it was her, the woman who held my hand during fertility appointments, the woman who cried with me after each failed round, the woman who swore she had my back. She had my back, all right, just long enough to stab it. I wanted to scream, to wake him up and throw the laptop at his face, but I didn't. Instead, I closed it, quietly, carefully. I lay back down next to him, heart racing, mind spiraling, and I knew two things for certain. One, I was done crying. Two, they were going to regret thinking I was weak. It's strange how something can be right in front of you for so long, and yet you choose not to see it. I had the proof now. Photo after photo, email after email. Claire writing things like, "I miss your arms," and David responding with, "Next trip, same suite," as if it was nothing, as if I didn't exist, as if I were just a footnote in their affair. But I wasn't a footnote. I was the wife. I was the woman who had spent years bleeding, breaking, hoping for a child with him, while they were sneaking around behind my back. The betrayal wrapped around me like smoke. It invaded everything, my memories, my body, my heart. Suddenly, every moment I had once cherished now had a bitter aftertaste. The nursery we painted together? Fake. The baby mugs? A lie. The late nights, the stress, the emotional distance, all pieces of a puzzle I'd refused to complete. I didn't confront him right away. I wanted to. God, I wanted to scream, to cry, to slap him awake and demand an explanation, as if anything he said could ever justify what he'd done. But I didn't. I waited, because deep down, something inside me had shifted. The Emily who begged, who blamed herself, who cried in bathrooms. She was gone. And the woman who replaced her? She was quiet, focused, dangerous. For 3 days, I acted as if nothing had happened. I cooked dinner. I folded his laundry. I even kissed him goodnight. He had no idea. He thought I was still in the dark, still clueless. But I was watching everything now. Every word, every movement, every text he tried to hide. I even went to lunch with Claire. I needed to see her face. She was glowing, not in the literal sense, but in the smug, self-satisfied way someone looks when they think they've won. She asked about David, pretending to be casual, and when I mentioned we were still waiting to be matched by the adoption agency, her lips curled ever so slightly. She looked me in the eyes and said, "Some people just aren't meant to be mothers. Maybe life's trying to tell you something." That was it. She'd crossed a line. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was cruelty, intentional cruelty. And I knew then that she didn't just want my husband. She wanted to become me. She wanted my life, my future, even my pain. But I also knew something she didn't. She hadn't taken David from me. She'd taken the worst part of my life off my hands. And that was the beginning of my plan. I started gathering everything. I printed the emails, the photos, the reservations. I backed up his call logs, his location data, his calendar invites. I had timelines, receipts, cold, irrefutable evidence. Then I called the adoption agency. I didn't tell them everything. Not yet. I just asked how things were going. They said a birth mother had been reviewing our profile, that we might get matched soon. It was the first time I'd felt joy in months. And at the same time, heartbreak. Because I knew that no matter how this unfolded, my marriage was over. Not just because he cheated, but because he abandoned me when I needed him most. Because when our life got hard, he turned to the one person who should have been family, and turned her into his secret. I wasn't just betrayed, I was discarded. But what David and Claire didn't know was that I wasn't planning to beg for closure. I wasn't going to give them a dramatic confrontation or a tearful breakdown. No, I was going to take my power back, on my terms. And it started that night. I sat across from David at dinner and asked him, "If you could start over, would you?" He looked up from his phone and blinked. "Start over how?" "With everything," I said softly. "Life, marriage, goals. Would you still choose this path?" He hesitated, just for a second. Then he said, "I mean, we all have regrets, right?" That was all I needed. I smiled. "Yeah, we do." He thought I was being deep, introspective. He had no idea I already had a new bank account, a new apartment lease, and a meeting scheduled with a lawyer. Because if he wanted a new path, I was about to give it to him. I won't lie. The nights that followed were some of the hardest of my life. It's one thing to discover betrayal. It's another to pretend you haven't. To lie beside the person who broke you, breathe the same air, smile like nothing's wrong, while your insides are in ruins. But the rage was stronger than the grief. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to beg. I'd done enough begging. To doctors, to fate, to the universe. I had cried every tear I had for this man, for this life we were building. And now I was ready to burn it down, silently. I started with the bank. David and I had a joint account, of course. We were married. We shared everything, or so I thought. But when I looked closely, I found several irregular transfers to a secondary account, his name only. I traced one of the transactions to a boutique hotel in Soho. 2 nights, champagne room service, spa package. He wasn't even trying to hide it. So I opened a separate account under my name, quietly transferred my half. I left just enough in the joint to keep things normal. I also created a secure folder, digital and physical, with every shred of evidence I had. Photos, emails, flight confirmations, even the necklace he had bought her for her birthday. I'd seen the receipt in his drawer, a thin silver chain, nothing extravagant, but it made me sick. Meanwhile, I reached out to the adoption agency again. I was terrified they might pull our profile, that they'd find out about the affair and decide we weren't a stable home. But to my surprise, they didn't. In fact, they said something that stopped me cold. "The birth mother actually responded positively to your letter, Emily. She mentioned how strong and resilient you seem." Me? Not us. Me. That was the first time I realized I didn't need David to be a mother. I never did. And suddenly, all the plans I'd built with him, the nursery, the shared dreams, the waiting, all of it felt like old wallpaper peeling off a wall. It was time for a full renovation, but I had to be strategic. David still thought everything was fine. I made sure of it. I smiled when he walked in. I kissed his cheek. I even planned a weekend getaway to reconnect. Of course, he said he was too busy, which was perfect. Because while he was working late, I was meeting with my lawyer. Her name was Rachel, and she was a force of nature. Sharp, direct, no time for tears. She looked at the folder I gave her and said, "You have more than enough, especially if you want to play this smart." And I did. I didn't want revenge that would make a scene. I wanted control. I wanted to take back my story, piece by piece, and leave David with exactly what he gave me: silence and shock. The plan? Simple. I'd wait for the adoption process to finalize, as a single parent. I'd move out, quietly. I'd file for divorce the day after I brought my child home. No warning, no letter on the counter, just absence. Let him come home to an empty apartment. No wife, no bank access, and the realization that he'd lost everything, without a fight. I imagined him standing in that quiet living room, nursery door slightly open, crib untouched. No note, no closure, only the echo of his own choices. But the best part? Claire wouldn't get what she thought she'd stolen, because David, the man she won, would now be publicly humiliated, legally cornered, and emotionally alone. And she'd be left holding the reality of a relationship built on betrayal. That shine they had, it would fade, quickly. Because men like David, they don't change. They just rotate their audience. And sisters like Claire, they never win. Not really. Because when you take something through cruelty, you carry the stain of it forever. One night, just weeks before the adoption was finalized, I stood in the nursery one last time. I'd packed everything. The books, the baby clothes, the small stuffed lion I'd bought during our first IVF round. It was all going with me. I looked around that room, the room that was supposed to be filled with joy, and I didn't cry. I smiled. Because this time, I wasn't leaving empty-handed. I was taking myself, my strength, my future, and soon, my child. When people betray you, they expect a reaction. They expect screaming, crying, shattered glass. But I gave them nothing. That was the first phase of my plan. Silence. David still thought I was clueless, that I was just playing house while he played me. Claire? She was worse. She smiled at every family dinner as if I didn't already know the kind of woman she really was. But the thing about people like them, they get sloppy when they feel safe, and I made sure they felt very, very safe. While they laughed behind my back, I was setting things in motion. I quietly moved all my money into a new bank account under my name only. I left just enough in the joint account to keep up appearances. I met with my lawyer, Rachel, twice a week. Sharp as a blade, she helped me prepare everything: the divorce papers, financial statements, documentation from the adoption agency, showing that I'd completed the final phase on my own. That part was important, because I was no longer applying as a couple. I had updated my file, my story, my future. And on a rainy Monday morning, I got the call I had dreamed of for years. "I wanted you to know," the agency coordinator said. "The birth mother officially chose you. The baby's due in 2 weeks." Tears filled my eyes, but they weren't from sadness. They were from relief, from power, from the knowledge that this child, my child, was arriving into a life built on truth, not illusion. I said nothing to David. Let him keep thinking we were still waiting. Let him keep sneaking off to hotel rooms with my sister, while I packed the nursery in quiet joy. I had already signed the lease on our new home, a cozy 2-bedroom apartment just outside the city. It had tall windows and a tiny balcony that caught the morning light. I painted the baby's room myself. Soft gray walls, a bookshelf already filled with stories I couldn't wait to read aloud. Every item I took from our old apartment was intentional, not a box more. I left behind the designer furniture, the wedding photos, the curated image of the life I once thought I wanted. What I took was mine. What I left was his mess to clean up. And then, Liam arrived. He was born 2 weeks early, 5 pounds, 10 fingers, 10 toes, and the strongest grip I've ever felt. The second I held him, the world narrowed down to him and me. Nothing else mattered. Not David, not Claire, not the pain. Only Liam. We spent 3 days at the hospital. I didn't tell a soul. No family, no friends. I just wanted to keep him to myself for a little longer. On the morning we were discharged, I packed our things and drove straight to our new home. No one knew where I was. That was the point. Back at the old apartment, I returned one last time. Not to live, but to finish what I started. David was supposed to be at work. I let myself in with my keys. The place felt hollow, soulless, just like our marriage had become. I walked through the nursery we once built together. The crib was still there, untouched. How ironic. He thought he was preparing for a future. He didn't even realize it had already passed him by. I left a folder on the dining table. Inside, copies of the emails he exchanged with Claire, hotel receipts, bank statements, divorce papers, a letter from the adoption agency stating I was now a single parent. It was neat, professional, cold, just like his betrayal. When he arrived home that night, I was waiting, sitting on the couch, holding Liam. He stopped in the doorway, completely still. "Whose baby is that?" he asked, eyes wide, voice shaky. "My son," I replied calmly. "Ours?" He tried again. I shook my head. "No, mine." He stepped forward like he was going to protest, to argue, to spin some pathetic version of the truth, but I stood up and handed him the folder. "You lost the right to call yourself a father the day you gave up on me." He flipped through the papers in silence. His face turned pale, and for once, David, the man who always had something clever to say, had no words. I looked him in the eyes and added, "Claire didn't steal you from me. She inherited a broken version of the man I once loved. Let her have what's left." And then I walked out the door. No drama, no shouting, just peace. The kind you earn after surviving hell. What would you have done in my place? Walked out quietly. Or made it all public? Tell me in the comments. And if this story hit home, like and share it with someone who needs to know they're not alone. They had no idea. That was the most satisfying part of it all. How completely unaware they were of what I was doing, while they carried on like they had won. David still kissed me goodbye every morning, still said, "Don't wait up," with that casual smirk that used to make me melt, before I knew it was meant for someone else. Claire still called me sis at family dinners, still sent me funny memes, still acted like she hadn't gutted me in silence. Let them think I was broken, distracted, fragile. Because while they played their game, I was building my escape. The new apartment was small but bright. A top-floor unit with creaky wooden floors and a little balcony that faced the sun. I signed the lease in cash, furnished it slowly. Soft grays, warm whites, nothing flashy, just calm. Meanwhile, I emptied myself out of the life I once shared with David, drawer by drawer, closet by closet. I left the expensive handbags he'd given me after every fertility failure. I didn't want reminders of apologies that meant nothing. I closed our joint credit cards and opened one in my name, quietly moved half of our savings into my own account. I made spreadsheets, lists, copies of everything I needed for the next step. I stopped asking David questions. Let him hang himself with his own routine. He thought I was tired, worn down. He wasn't entirely wrong, but I was also focused, and more dangerous than I had ever been. The day the agency called to say the adoption was finalized, I sat on my kitchen floor and cried, not because I was scared, but because I knew I had made it. Through the heartbreak, through the humiliation, through the silent war I never asked for, I was going to be a mother, without him. When Liam was born, I didn't tell anyone. I didn't need the chaos. I needed space to fall in love with him quietly. He was tiny, calm. His eyes opened slowly, and I swear he looked straight into me. For a long time, I just held him against my chest and breathed. No words, no noise, just us. On the third day, we left the hospital and went home, not to the apartment David and I once shared, but to our home, mine and Liam's. Everything I needed was already waiting. Diapers, bottles, a hand-knit blanket my friend Marissa had made, never knowing it would actually be used one day. A rocking chair in the corner, next to a shelf full of storybooks I couldn't wait to read to him. That evening, I returned to the old apartment one final time. I had the keys. David didn't even know I'd been gone. The place looked exactly the same, and yet completely foreign. I stood there in silence for a few minutes, just taking it in. The clean kitchen, the nursery that had never seen a child, the wedding photo still hanging by the hallway. Then I pulled the manila folder from my bag and laid it on the dining table. Neat, clean, labeled. Inside were copies of everything. The emails, the photos, the receipts, and the official confirmation from the agency that I was now, legally and entirely, a single mother on top, the signed divorce papers. Simple, final, no letter, no dramatic farewell, just facts. The kind of truth even he couldn't spin. I stood there for a moment longer, letting the silence wash over me. Then I left. That night, David came home around 8 p.m. He still had his work bag slung over one shoulder when he walked in and found me sitting in the living room, holding Liam. He stopped dead in his tracks. His face said everything. Shock, confusion, fear. "Whose baby is that?" he asked. Not softly, more like someone bracing for an answer he already knew. I stood, looked him in the eyes. "My son." He blinked. "Ours?" "No. Mine." He took a step forward, but I raised my hand. "You don't get to ask questions anymore," I said. "Everything you need to know is on the table." He turned slowly, picked up the folder, and opened it. With each page, his expression changed. Denial fading into realization, realization into dread. And still, I said nothing. When he finally looked back up, I could see it in his eyes. He had lost. Not just the marriage, not just the baby, but the illusion of control. "Emily, wait, can we talk?" "No," I said quietly. "You made your choices. Now I'm making mine." I walked past him, out the door, down the hall, into the elevator, holding my son close against my chest. I didn't look back. I didn't hear from David for 3 days. Not a call, not a message, not even a knock at the door. At first, I thought maybe he'd vanished, disappeared into the shame he'd created for himself. But no. On the fourth day, he finally showed up outside the new apartment. I watched him through the peephole. He looked smaller, paler, like someone who hadn't slept. He knocked once, then again, then said, almost in a whisper, "Emily, please." I didn't open the door. He didn't deserve to see this version of me, the one who was no longer afraid, no longer apologizing for being broken. I had no interest in hearing him grovel. Regret doesn't erase betrayal, especially when the regret only shows up after the consequences. Eventually, he left, but that was just the beginning. Within weeks, the story began to spread. Not because I told it, I didn't need to. The folder I left behind had done the talking for me. David's image, the charming, successful husband, the golden boy, started to crack, first in whispers, then in conversations, then in full-blown silence from the people who once adored him. His own parents called me, not to defend him, but to apologize. They had seen the truth. I could hear the weight in his mother's voice when she said, "I had no idea. You didn't deserve that." Claire wasn't spared either. From what I heard, she had expected David to leave me for her. She thought he'd propose, maybe start a new life with her now that I was out of the way. But instead of romance, she got avoidance. He stopped texting as often, stopped calling, stopped showing up altogether. Because what do you do when your affair partner turns into a mirror for everything you ruined? They tried to hold it together for a while, but it didn't last. Claire lost most of her friends. People began to see her not as the fun, spontaneous girl, but as the woman who seduced her sister's husband while pretending to be a shoulder to cry on. That's not something you recover from easily. And me? I was building something new. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't loud, but it was mine. Liam grew quickly. He laughed often. He loved to be held, to be sung to fall asleep curled on my chest. Every milestone, his first smile, his first time rolling over, the first time he looked up at me and actually reached for my face, felt like a tiny miracle. Sometimes, I'd catch myself crying at 2 a.m., not from sadness, but from awe. This life, this quiet, imperfect, beautiful life, was the one I had fought for, and I had won. I went back to work part-time, with flexible hours. My boss, a woman who had quietly supported me through the worst of it, offered me a project-based role so I could still be present for Liam. For once, work didn't feel like a place I had to prove myself. It felt like a place where I could just be. One day, about 2 months after I left David, I ran into an old friend of ours at the farmer's market. She looked at Liam, then at me, and said something I'll never forget. "You seem lighter, happier. Like, you came back to yourself." And I had, because that's what people never tell you. You don't just lose things when you go through betrayal. You find things too. You find your strength. You find your limits. You find your voice. And most of all, you find out who you really are when no one's watching. David lost the family he thought was waiting for him at the finish line. Claire lost the illusion of being the center of attention. But me? I gained a future I never thought I'd have. Not despite the pain, but because of it. One morning, Liam and I sat on our balcony as the sun came up. He giggled at birds flying by, tiny hands flailing in excitement. I looked at him, completely unaware of the storm he had been born into, and whispered, "We're going to be okay." Not just okay. We were going to be better than before. They said I'd never be a mother. They said it in hushed tones, in smug glances, in those backhanded comments dressed up as concern. They said it with pity, with judgment, sometimes with outright cruelty. And now? Now they can't even look me in the eye. Not because I screamed, not because I exposed them, but because I rose, quietly, powerfully, without permission, and without apology. It took me a long time to realize that motherhood isn't just about biology. It's not just about perfect timing or a supportive husband or a family who claps when you announce the news. Motherhood is about presence, about choosing to show up, even when you're tired, about loving so deeply it rewires your soul, about rebuilding your life, brick by brick, so that a child has a safe place to land. And I did that. I did it alone. I did it after being betrayed by the two people I once trusted most. I did it when no one believed in me, when people smiled to my face and mocked me behind closed doors. I am not angry anymore. I'm not seeking revenge. I'm not counting the number of people who wronged me or waiting for their apologies. Because the truth is, I don't need anything from them. They took their shot, and I survived. More than that, I healed. Every time I hold my son, I'm reminded that I didn't just survive what happened. I transformed. I became someone stronger, softer, wiser. Would I go through it all again? Yes, because it led me here, to this version of myself, the one who finally learned to love without begging, to protect herself without guilt, and to let go without needing closure. So if you're listening to this, and you feel broken, if someone told you that you weren't enough, that your dream was out of reach, that you were too much, or not enough, or simply not meant to, I'm here to tell you, they're wrong. You get to decide who you are, and no one gets to write your ending but you. Have you ever had to walk away from someone who didn't believe in you? Have you ever had to start over from scratch when everyone thought you couldn't? Tell me in the comments. I want to hear your story. Let's lift each other up. And if this one touched your heart, give it a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe, because I have so many stories still to tell. And trust me, you don't want to miss what comes next.